This is Survey of Economics PowerPoint Lecture 3.1 on international trade, international economics. And you see what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the mechanics of international trade and how it works, the advantages of free trade, the arguments in favor of protectionism, the instruments of protectionism, in other words, how they do that, what the tools are available. Then we'll look at somewhat at U.S. international trade patterns over the years, and then at the end we'll talk about the international trade institutions, the World Trade Organization, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The first thing to understand is how trade balance works. You hear a lot in the news media about the balance of trade and the deficits. When they talk about a deficit in trade, they're talking about current accounts. Current accounts measures the flow of goods and services, okay, imports and exports. That's different than capital accounts. Capital accounts studies the flow of money. The sum of all current accounts among all countries, and the sum of all capital accounts for that matter, when you sum it all together, it is zero. Okay, if one country exports $100 worth, then another country has to be importing that $100 worth. And so the balance between the two sums to zero. Okay, furthermore, current accounts plus capital accounts add up to zero. Because if a country sells $100, okay, then $100 is held in their account. All right. If we sell $100, then another country owes us $100. And so a positive in the current account is a negative in the capital account. When someone else owes me money, okay, it's a negative for me. If I have someone else's money, it's a positive for me in capital accounts. All right. So when I import, I get the goods and services, but I owe them money. That money is held in my bank. Okay. And so I actually benefit from that. Okay, and we'll deal with that more. We'll deal with that more to end any confusion. All right, now I want to trace out this seemingly complicated looking model because it's really not that complicated. What you want to consider from the outset is what we talked about in the preceding lecture about monetary system and monetary policy and how monetary system works. We brought up in that PowerPoint the idea, and we'll bring it up again now, of the dual use of money in banking. And it's a very simple thing to understand. Anytime money is deposited in a bank, that bank's reserves go up. They get to take those reserves and lend them out, okay, to whomever. So now let's trace this out so that we can see how international trade works. The other thing kind of to keep in the back of your mind, which I guess a lot of people don't realize still, is that when countries trade, okay, they don't put a big giant sack of money on a ship and send it to the country. If we import goods from the People's Republic, okay, from China, we don't take money and put it on a ship and send it over to China. What happens with the money is it gets deposited in the Chinese corporation's account in the United States. Okay, we'll bring this up when we get to the idea of freezing assets and how that works. Okay, so let's start with our friend, the U.S. importer. The U.S. importer buys Chinese goods. Okay, let's say they buy 6,300 yuan worth of goods. Well, at the time that we created this, the yuan, and it's not too far from this right now, but the yuan, okay, $1 was equal to 6.3 yuan. Okay, so for those 6,300 yuan worth of goods, the U.S. importer goes to the bank and deposits $1,000. The bank sends the Chinese exporter a check for 6,300 yuan. But as happened in our discussion of how banking works from the preceding lecture, okay, that bank now has $1,000 more in reserves, which they can lend out to whomever they like. All right. Now, the Chinese exporter takes its $6,300 check and they deposit that in the bank. What can they do with that? Well, go back to the dual use of money. They can pay their bills, pay their workers, pay for the manufacturing, whatever, and the Chinese bank gets to lend that money out. All right. Same thing works in reverse when the U.S. is exporting to China. All right. And that we're going over here again what we went over in the discussion of banking and how banking works. It's the dual use of deposits. It all rests on the dual use of deposits. Whenever money is deposited into a bank, both the bank and the depositor get to use it. From the preceding slide, okay, when the U.S. importer takes $1,000 and deposits it, the bank gets to use that money. They get to lend it out. So too, the U.S. importer exchanges that money for a 6,300 yuan check, which it gives to the Chinese exporter. All right? Simple enough to understand. The depositor uses it to pay expenses. The bank gets to lend it out. And so what that means is that each time money is taken and deposited, the bank gets to lend it. That money is then deposited into a bank, which can then lend it, etc. And so what matters in international trade, and this is what escapes most people, even if you listen to the media, like currently, this is February of 2019, the United States and the Chinese are in trade negotiations after the initiation of a trade war by Donald Trump, the president of the United States, okay, back in the late summer, early fall of 2018. All right. What people don't seem to realize, even the media, when they go over this, they talk about the negative effects of current accounts and imports and exports. But what they don't talk about is the main negative from an economic standpoint. What matters is less the direction of trade and more the volume of trade because of the dual use of money. It doesn't really matter which direction the trade's going in, because when the U.S. is importing a bunch from China, those importers are taking money and depositing it in banks, which can then lend it out. All right. Now, to reiterate this, we take a couple of lessons from U.S. history. The greatest period of economic decline in the history of the United States since they've been measuring it was the Great Depression from 1933 to 1940. This was characterized, this period also witnessed improvements in the current accounts balance, but it had the lowest volume of trade as a percentage of GDP since they've been tracking it. And we'll look at that in a graphic here in just a second. Whereas the two periods of greatest growth in U.S. history, which were from in the 1990s and most recently after the Great Recession in 2009 until today. Okay, well, these are characterized by increasing current account deficits. Throughout the 90s, the U.S. ran current account deficits, particularly with the People's Republic of China. Okay, from 9 to 18, those deficits have increased, but these two periods are also noted as the greatest periods of economic prosperity in the United States. Why? Because of the dual use of money. You're increasing the volume. That's increasing the availability of reserves at banks, which they can lend out for investment and consumption. Okay? We look at that here graphically, and let's look first at the 1930s. Okay? Comparatively to today, a very low percentage in the volume of trade. This is as a percentage of the gross domestic product at the time. Okay? And you see that during the Great Depression, from really 31 through 39, as a percentage of gross domestic product, trade becomes less and less. This is also the period of the greatest economic catastrophe. Why? Because of the dual use of money. Because there is no trade, there are no deposits being made. All right? Because there is no deposits being made, banks don't increase their reserves. This bottoms out and then begins to pick up after the Second World War. Now we look at the other two periods. This is the first period of dramatic economic growth in U.S. history during the 90s. It was at the time the longest period of consistent growth in U.S. history. That has been now outstripped by today. Look at the percentage of gross domestic product that trade comprises. The volume of trade goes up consistently, topping out a little less than 25%. During this entire period, the U.S. is running a progressively worse, okay, a progressively negative current account deficit. This is because capital accounts are going up. More money is being held in U.S. banks because of the increased volume of trade. Then you have the recession in 2001. Trade drops as a percentage of the gross domestic product, and you have a recession. Then we have increases in the volume. Then we have the Great Recession. Note, in the Great Recession, there is a decline in trade as a volume of as a percentage of gross domestic product. After the Great Recession, you see now their trade is a greater percentage, up until the trade war, of course. Trade is a greater percentage of gross domestic product than ever before, and you also have the longest period of economic growth. All right? And so the data definitely supports the idea that what matters is less the direction of trade and more the volume of trade. And so a trade war which cuts volume of trade is a negative thing for the economy. We now look at the U.S. balance of trade, the current account balance, and you see that during the 30s, the Great Depression, this supports what we just said in the last two slides. During the 30s, the U.S. is running nearly even in terms of its current accounts. Beginning really in 83, it runs a trade deficit. Now, the other period of great economic recovery was in the 80s, from 83 to 87, until a recession hit in 87. Okay, and you see again, negative volume, or rather negative current accounts, but you have an increased volume. Then you look at the 90s, and this is what we were saying, is that in the 90s, the U.S. runs a progressively worse current account deficit, okay? But at the same time, the volume of trade is going through the roof. So as a result, bank reserves are increasing. Banks have greater liquidity that they lend out. That partially explains the rampant growth in the 90s, okay? And again, we see that throughout the Bush administration, the current account deficit gets better till 2008. Look at 2007 to 2009. This is the Great Recession. This is the best current account that the U.S. has run in how long? Since the 1990s. Okay, their current account deficit was here, plunged down to here, and so it picked up in 2007, 2008, but the volume of trade dropped. Okay, the current accounts did better. And so now we have this period of growth where we're running these current account deficits, but the volume of trade is increasing. And so hopefully I've reiterated the point enough that what we're working with here is volume of trade, not direction of trade, for economic prosperity. We're going to now take a look at the different, there are two diametrically opposed strategies in trade, and every country does a mix of them, okay? The first is on free trade, and then we'll look at protectionism. Free trade, very simply put, means no restrictions to trade. These are the advantages. First, you have increased competition. Now, you remember from our micro panel what the advantages of competition are. Competition moves the economy towards economic efficiency. The increased and we'll go through this in detail in a minute here, okay? Secondly, you have specialization of function. Again, remember from our discussion of microeconomics what specialization of function does. It's predicated on comparative advantage, which we talked about at the very beginning. Ultimately, specialization of function creates an economy of scale. it means a reduction in marginal cost. If you can recall, what we did was we said, oh, okay, because people are specializing, the marginal product of each unit of a variable resource, okay, increases, is greater than the preceding unit until you reach this point of capital saturation. You reach a maximum point. Thereafter, it drops. That's the development of an economy of scale. Okay, when you trade for things, all right, you take advantage of specialization of function. Everyone kind of intuitively knows this, even though they don't phrase it to themselves. In fact, all of you, if you're students, you know this. Okay, this is why students select a major. By selecting a major in college, what you are suggesting is that you are going to specialize in something, namely whatever you major in. Okay, so for example, if you decide that you're going to major in nursing, what you are declaring is that you are going to specialize in nursing. You are going to maximize your production of nursing, okay, and then trade for anything else you need, all right? That's because you know the idea of specialization of function. You can't do everything, not efficiently, okay? And so you specialize in one thing. I specialize in teaching. I maximize my production of it and then trade for whatever else I need. And we'll look at that again in just a minute. We're going to look at each of these in detail. The third thing is the expansion of markets. Okay, simple enough, easy to understand. If the United States trades with the People's Republic of China, the producers in the United States increase their potential market by 1.6 billion people. The Chinese, for their part, when they trade with the United States, they expand their market by a potentially 340 million people. Simple enough. Now, another of the advantages is consumer choice. The presence, the existence of foreign products increases a consumer's choice in buying options, okay? You have more alternative and substitute products, okay? And so, for example, there was a time in the early and mid 60s after Packard and those guys had gone under, that there were essentially three types of automobiles you could buy. You could buy General Motors, you could buy Chrysler, or you could buy Ford, okay? But then in the 70s, they allowed for the importation of Japanese vehicles and then European vehicles. And so as a result, you have a much larger selection of vehicles from which you can buy. And so the consumers benefit from this. And to prove this to yourself, treat yourself to that one of the most wonderful experiences, which is car shopping on University Boulevard in Moon Township. Every automobile on the planet can be purchased there. I don't think they sell Teslas there, but I just saw that Musk is going to be discontinuing any showroom sale of Teslas. They're going to be selling them online only, but at any rate. And so this does a couple of things. First of all, the alternative and substitutes increases the level of competition, which we had up here, and it gives consumers more choice. And then lastly is the thing we focused on for those few slides there, which is in addition to all of this, when you have no restrictions to trade and the volume of trade increases, bank reserves increase, okay? And as bank reserves increase, banks have more money to lend out. That will both have create a pressure for reducing interest rates or keeping them low, and increase the amount of money that banks can lend out. So it will increase both consumption and investment. To go through these individually, okay? First, let's look at competition. We saw this before, if you can recall from our microeconomic panel. Here we have our original supply line, supply curve, and here we have demand. This is our original point of equilibrium. If we allow foreign competition, if we import from overseas, that expands supply, shifting the supply curve this way. Okay, at every price level, you have more supply. As a result, that shifts the equilibrium point down to E2, which means you have lower price, greater quantity. What that's going to do over here comes from, again, microeconomics from our marginal cost. Here is our marginal cost curve, okay? If we reduce the price, such as we do by moving from E1 to E2, When the price reduces, it drops down, reducing profit. All right? Eventually, what this does is wipe out all profit altogether. We reach the point where the price equals the minimum marginal cost. It will also equal the minimum average total cost, which is, by definition, economic efficiency. Now, the problem with it is, okay, and where one of the arguments for protectionism is, okay, doing this, yes, moves the economy towards economic efficiency, but look at what happens. It results, the consequence of it is reduced production for domestic producers. And with reduced production, you have greater unemployment. You need fewer workers, all right? And the idea is that the advantages of the increased competition moving towards efficiency outweigh the consequences of producing less. What'll end up happening is because you're producing less of this product, you'll shift into an alternative product. Okay, if you can remember alternative production possibilities, you'll shift into the production of another product that you produce more efficiently. Okay, or that you have a competitive advantage in, I guess I would say. And we'll look at that when we get to specialization of function. We now get to specialization of function, okay? And this is the argument we made for specialization of function, okay? Each unit of a variable resource, the production of every unit of a variable resource increases from the preceding unit until you hit the point of capital saturation, this maximum point. Thereafter, it diminishes. Well, as marginal quantity is going up, the marginal cost, the cost per unit, is going down to hit this minimum point. This is why they're mirror images of each other. Okay? We studied this at microeconomics. Well, this argument holds true also at the international level. When a country specializes in the production of one thing, their production of that thing increases, pushing it to its potential gross domestic product and reducing marginal cost. Okay? And as I said, this is the main reason that people specialize in something. Whatever skill they specialize in, this is why they specialize in it. The more they do it, the more efficient they become at it. Okay? Till they reach the maximum potential. And so they trade for everything else. We'll now take a look at a hypothetical, and this is based on, actually it's actually pretty close, but it's based on production levels. This is a production possibilities curve, and you can see the curve, okay? The United States can either produce 300 million manufactured goods per year or 150 million services per year, okay? And so you see that the curve would go something like this, and I have it in a graphic right after this, so you can look at it. Now, this is based on the idea of comparative advantage, which we brought up very much towards the beginning of our class, okay? This incorporates the idea of a sacrifice ratio. For every 20 units of manufactured goods that you give up producing in the United States, they get 40 units of services. That means for every 2 manufactured goods, you get 4 services. For every 20, you get 40. That means basically 1/2. You're sacrificing 20 manufactured goods for 40 services. Okay, that's 1/2. Every manufactured good you give up gives you 2 services. All right, and you just go down the line. This is the same thing with the People's Republic of China. Now, the one thing you notice is we talked a little bit when we first introduced the idea of the advantages. We talked about absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is where you can produce more of something. You'll note that the United States has the absolute advantage in both, and this is true. Okay, given all available resources, the United States can outproduce China both in manufactured goods and in services. That does not mean they will not trade. That does not mean they will not trade because of this sacrifice ratio. As the U.S. transfers out of the production of manufacturing and into the production of services, they get more and more services, okay, for each manufactured good sacrificed than does the People's Republic of China. It's a relative measure, all right? It costs the U.S. less to transfer out of manufacturing. I say here, okay, so we read through this. The U.S. exchanges one manufactured unit for 1/2 of a service, okay? Why? Because if they sacrifice all 300 manufactured goods, they get 150 services. Okay, so for every 2 manufactured goods, they get 1 service. So 1 manufactured unit gives you 1/2 a unit of services. Reciprocally, for each service sacrificed, gets 2 manufactured goods. Over here in China, it's a very different story. Look at their sacrifice ratio. If they transfer out of 250 manufactured goods, they get only 90 service goods, okay, or services, units of services, right? And so for every 1 manufactured unit, they get 9/25 of a service. That's much less than the United States, all right? The United States gets 1/2 a unit of services for each manufactured good. China only gets 9/25. 9/25 is less than half. Reciprocally, for each service sacrificed, they get 25/9. The U.S., for every service sacrificed, only gets 2 manufactured goods. China gets 25/9, which is greater than 2. Okay? We'll look at this. I've graphically depicted this using Excel and drawing some lines. This is the United States production possibility curve. We have manufactured goods down here, 300. We have services up here, it was 150. And so you see, now you see that it's not even, and that's what we would expect. We would expect it to be curved like this because of the fungibility of resources. It's a variable sacrifice ratio, but if you draw a straight line from here to here, you see that it's a 2-to-1 ratio. For every 2 of these, you get 1 of these. This is the same curve for the People's Republic of China, okay? They sacrifice 250, they get 90. This is what their curve looks like, all right? Now we'll look at it as a trade pattern. And already we're starting to move in the direction that, okay, the way trade should work then is the U.S. should produce services and trade that with the Chinese for Chinese manufactured goods. For the longest time, that is how it works, but that's been changing recently, and we'll take a look at that. All right, now we want to think about terms of trade. And I think I've mentioned this already. Terms of trade, very simply put, is money in versus money out, okay? It's literally how much you're getting for each thing, okay? Better terms of trade means you're getting more for each unit that you're trading. We look at the average sacrifice ratio throughout the entire system. So let the general ratio be 5 manufactured goods for 2 services. For every service, you get 2.5 manufactured goods, okay, which means services are more valuable. And they typically are. They have a greater value added. Remember about value added? They have more value added, okay, because they have a greater quality, a greater skill of services, a greater skill of labor, basically. Now, let's go back and look at the U.S. For the U.S., when it sacrifices 5 units of manufacturing, it gets 2.5 services domestically. So it doesn't benefit them to trade manufactured goods. Conversely, domestically, for each 2 units of services, it sacrifices, it gets only 4 units. Well, if it traded these 2 units of services, internationally, they would get 5 units of manufacturing. So they would do better to trade services, okay, for manufacturing. The exact opposite condition exists in China. This is why a trade relationship is implied between the 2 of them. What that trade relationship is, we'll take a look at in a minute. When China sacrifices 5 units of manufacturing, it only gets 1 4/5, 9/5, a unit of services. Well, if they did that internationally, they'd get 2 services. So they'd do better to trade their manufactured goods for any services they need, okay? Uh, and so it does better to trade for services and produce manufactured goods. Let's look graphically now at what we've been setting up for the relationship between the United States and China in trade. Okay, now let's look at it from the U.S. perspective, from what we've just come up with given sacrifice ratios. The U.S., okay, this is the U.S. line without trade. Okay, it could produce 300 manufactured goods or give up producing manufactured goods and produce 150 services. You see, internationally, in trading with the Chinese, given the terms of trade, if the United States specialized and built only services, they could exchange all those services for 2.5, okay, getting 375 manufactured goods. If they domestically produced 150 services and sacrificed them all, they'd only get 300 manufactured goods. But if the U.S. produces 150 and sells them all, trades them all, okay, they would get 375. So the U.S. gains this by engaging in trade with someone that specializes in manufacturing, like China. Looking at it from the perspective of China, here we have services over here, manufactured goods here. The Chinese domestically can produce 250 manufactured goods or 90 services. Well, if they produce 250 and domestically sacrifice it, they get for their 250, they get 90. But if they do it internationally, it's a 2.5 to 1 ratio. They sell off all their manufactured goods, okay, and they would get 100 services. So it benefits them to trade as well, but it benefits them less than the United States. All right? Based on this argument, okay, what you would expect to see in terms of a trade, and that's what we're dealing with here, is we're trying to explain and we're trying to predict. What we would expect to see based on this comparative advantage idea is that the U.S. would produce services and specialize in services and then sell those for manufacturing goods. And that China would do exactly the opposite. They'd specialize in manufacturing goods and sell them for services. So what we would expect is that there would be progressively less U.S. exports of goods to China and more imports of goods from China, and more U.S. exports of services to China and less imports of services from China. Okay? The U.S. should specialize in manufacturing or in services. The Chinese specialize in manufacturing, and then they trade them with each other. That's what we would expect to see from comparative advantage. Let's find out if that's what we see. From the empirical numbers, we can see that that's not entirely true. You see here, percentage change in U.S. imports of goods from the People's Republic of China. Okay, what we would expect to have happen here is that the percentage change would be going up. Okay, we start with a 30% change in 2004 of U.S. imports of goods from China. What we note is that that drops off. Now, note that it drops off completely in 2008 during the Great Recession. This we saw before. This is when the volume of trade between the two just absolutely tanks, okay? And it is consistent, as we've said before, and as we established before with empirical data. It shows that the volume of trade is correlated to economic prosperity. When economic prosperity drops, so does the volume of trade, okay? So the amount of imports of goods from China drops. It then spikes again, but now recently has dropped off and has gone up. Now, what the Trump administration wants to have happen is they want this to drop off and begin going down this way, less of a percentage of goods being bought from China. Okay, well, we see what happened last time that happened. Okay, you tanked out in the recession. Okay, you tanked out in a recession back here in 2015, but it was a very minor, it wasn't really actually a recession. Growth levels in the US just slowed down. All right, so two, this is the US exports of goods to China. We would expect that to drop off precipitously based on our argument for comparative advantage. Okay, but we note from this that it doesn't in any way drop off precipitously. It does right here. The US is exporting less goods to China, but then it picks up. Okay, drops off again, picks up, drops off, picks up. So there's no distinct pattern here. What we would expect here is a pattern that would go like this. Okay, so that imports of goods from China continue to increase. And here we would expect a pattern that would go like this. But there is no consistency there. This leads us to the inevitable conclusion that comparative advantage does not provide us with the best explanation of the pattern of trade between the United States and China. The question, of course, is what does? Just to further reiterate what we would expect here, this is in services, percentage change in U.S. imports of services. We would expect this, based on our comparative advantage argument, to drop off. Now, it's dropped off a good bit, okay? There's more of a pattern here than there was in the previous slide. And we would expect that exports of service to China would go up, would go like this. The U.S. would be selling more and more services and buying more and more manufactured goods. But we see there is no pattern of that. Okay, in fact, the exports of services to the PRC have dropped. Okay, that's one of the reasons for the increase, the precipitous increase in the current accounts deficit with China. Okay, and it has to do with a deliberate attempt on the part of China to shift its comparative advantage. Okay? What they've been trying to do in China is improve the skill set of their labor force. Okay? They've been training them more and more in technology so that they can produce more services themselves. Okay? But again, there is not the pattern. The pattern that we would have predicted from comparative advantage does not exist here. The empirical data does not support it. And again, the question is why? Okay, the answer lies in competitive advantage. Okay, why does the trade pattern vary from the prediction given the discussion of comparative advantage and specialization? I mean, that's a strong logical argument between with comparative advantage and specialization. The logic behind that argument is inescapable. Okay, but there are two problems. The first are political factors. The manufacturing sector in the US represents a viable demographic bloc in voting. These are the guys that elected Donald Trump. Hence, US politicians have incentives in championing that sector. Okay, even though it means a suboptimal economic outcome, even though it reduces the efficiency of the industrial sector, okay, or of the sector in general, okay, not just industrial sector, but other sectors as well. Even though it reduces the efficiency of the economy, for political reasons, there is pressure that is brought to bear to protect the manufacturing sector. Okay, that's one reason. The larger reason has to do with competitive advantage. Now, we talked early on about the three different advantages: absolute, competitive, and comparative. Now that we're dealing with the international level, we've looked at absolute, we've looked at comparative. Comparative was not a particularly powerful explanatory device. The reason for that is partially this, but moreover, competitive advantage. Okay? The average wage of your Chinese urban manufacturing worker is about $1.20 an hour. Their US equivalent is about 18.25. That's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics from a couple of years back. Okay, you see the problem. It means that the Chinese, whether it's services or manufacturing goods, okay, and this is true for the services too, they make less. We're focusing specifically on the manufacturing sector here. This means that the Chinese have a distinct competitive advantage. And that's why I say a similar disparity in service wages and costs explains the rising trend that we saw from the previous slide in outsourcing and importing both goods and services from the PRC. So competitive advantage is a much better explanatory device. To make all of that simpler, okay, to say it more briefly, what explains the pattern the most is that the Chinese have a competitive advantage. They have a competitive advantage because they don't pay their workers as much. In fact, you see, they pay them, what is that, 1/15 or so? Not even. Uh, okay, so they pay them a lot less. That gives them a competitive advantage. They're starting to take that over in services. The U.S. is importing more and more of its services from China as well. We know this from China and from India. We could make this India too. Anybody that has ever called up for technical support experiences this, okay? Because the person with whom you're talking generally is in India, all right? When I had to get my mother's computer fixed, when I had to get that sorted out some years back, I called a guy and I finally asked the guy, I said, where are you physically located? He was in Hyderabad, India, okay? Because he makes a lot less money. And so that's the competitive advantage. We see now the general pattern of trade in the current accounts with the Chinese. We see this balance, and we see this is what the Trump administration is all aflutter about, is that there has just been a precipitous deficit run and it's increased. Okay, that seems like a really bad thing. You look at that and it seems like a really bad thing until you realize that the volume of trade has gone up consistently. And during this entire period, look at this. This is so odd. During this period of growth, you have an increasing trade deficit, but you have increasing volume. This is the period of the Great Recession. The trade deficit improves, but the volume of trade goes down. Here, we have another consistent period of growth, all right? And the trade deficit gets worse. To kind of wrap up the argument in favor of free trade, we finish this, and I mentioned this already. U.S. producers expand potential market by exporting to China from 330 million, which is the domestic market, to about 1.6 billion. Okay, Chinese exporters expand potential market by exporting to U.S. from 1.27 billion. I don't know where I got that. It should be 1.6 billion. Oh, I get it, because we're adding, that was well, okay, I get it, when China was 1.27 billion. So Chinese exporters expand the potential market by exporting to the U.S. from the domestic market of 1.27 billion to add the U.S. market, and you get 1.6 billion. For the U.S., the domestic market of 330 million is expanded to include the Chinese market, which puts the total at 1.6 billion. Got it now. Okay. Also, consumer choice, and I mentioned this. The improvement in consumer choice in the U.S. auto industry, and you can expand this to any industry, by trade. Okay, you get more alternative products, more substitute products. You have greater consumer choice.